All right, let's go ahead and get started today. We've made our way to the 20th century and getting closer to the contemporary period, although many of the things might still seem quite distant. Quite a bit of changes to Christianity in the 20th century, as we've seen throughout. And with politics, of course, there's a variety of things that we could look at, but there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. During the First World War, Russia experienced its own revolution as Marxist revolutionaries under the leadership of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov took over Russia. He was better known by his pen name Lenin, and so that's what most people know him by. He was a socialist who had been in some leadership positions before the revolution, but came to its head in 1917. The revolution would eventually overthrow the Tsar, the ruler of Russia, and his government, as well as withdraw from World War I. Eventually, several of the regions in the area would be brought together in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, or sometimes referred to as the Soviet Union. In the midst of all this, the Russian Orthodox Church has a very difficult position. If you remember some of the things we talked about back in the 18th century, we talked about how the state in Russia had engaged in several activities to try and bring the Russian Orthodox Church further and further under state control. And so even into the late 19th and early 20th century, the Russian Orthodox Church was looking for greater freedoms, even prior to the revolution. But it did receive some freedoms under Lenin's government. But as the revolution kind of became firmly entrenched, became the institution, the church found itself subordinated to the state as well, especially because the state promoted a very militant atheism. Monasteries were closed. Later, many of them became forced labor camps, and pretty much all of them were closed by the Second World War. Churches were sometimes closed, sometimes destroyed. Clergy were arrested. And under the Soviet government, the church went underground, essentially, went into hiding. But it appears that the majority of people maintained their belief in God, their commitment to the Orthodox Church, despite this persecution. It just wasn't open. But by the beginning years of World War II, the Soviet leaders decided to ease some of the restrictions on the Orthodox Church in order to gain the allegiance of the people. Right? So it's kind of this nationalistic appeal, because as they're getting ready to enter into World War II, they need the support of their people, and so one of the ways they garner support is through easing some of these restrictions. A patriarch was allowed to be elected in 1943. This was the first time in 20 years that there had been a patriarch in Moscow. Which leads us into World War II. The unfortunate truth of World War II is that sometimes people who identify themselves as Christians supported Nazi and fascist regimes in Europe. Sometimes it was very public support. Many Christians applauded Hitler in those early years because Hitler outlawed pornography. He supported a variety of other moral laws, and so Christians looked at that aspect of Hitler and said, "Oh, this is great. He's trying to have a moral government." And because of that, sometimes Christians were silent when Hitler sent Jews and others to the death camps. Pope Pius XII, the Pope at the time, seems to have tried to exercise some moral authority in all of this by presenting himself as above the fray. But he also supported oppressive fascist regimes in Spain and in Italy, remained silent about Hitler's atrocities, largely because the papacy had a very precarious position in Europe at the time. German Protestant liberals often found themselves supportive of Hitler because the language he was using was similar to what they were saying: the perfectibility of the human race, the need to civilize the world. But there were other Christians who were quite outspoken about Nazism, and often they faced persecution, imprisonment, and sometimes death or exile. A good example of that is the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer grew up in Berlin, studied at the university there, becomes a Lutheran pastor, but he had traveled and was living in London at the time that the Nazis came to power. And as he saw Nazism spread, he became very concerned, returned to Germany, knowing it was dangerous for him. In the midst of all this, he writes perhaps his most famous work, The Cost of Discipleship. Largely, Bonhoeffer, in this book, is very critical of how the Reformed Church, the Protestant Church, has been separating faith and obedience. A lot of emphasis on faith, but not much emphasis on obedience. And so, largely, he looked at this as being what he called cheap grace. Here's a quote: "Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. Baptism without church discipline. Communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ." On the other hand was what he called costly grace. Again quoting, "Costly grace confronts us as a gracious call to follow Jesus. It comes as a word of forgiveness to the broken spirit and the contrite heart. It is costly because it compels a man to submit to the yoke of Christ and follow him. It is grace because Jesus says, 'My yoke is easy and my burden is light.' Costly grace is the gospel, which must be sought again and again and again. The gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life. And it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin. And grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it costs God the life of his Son. You were bought at a price. What has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God." Facing a lot of challenges and persecution, in 1939, Bonhoeffer headed to the United States to take up an academic position at Union Theological Seminary. Largely, this was due to pressure that he had received from the Gestapo. He stays for 4 weeks before he decides to return to Germany. He becomes entangled with a conspiracy to kill Hitler, even though, of course, he's talking about murder. But one of the things that Bonhoeffer claimed was this was something that was needed. Hitler needed to be stopped. He was arrested by the Gestapo in April of 1943 and continued to write. Eventually, these works were published as letters and papers from prison. He was hanged in 1945, along with thousands of others who had resisted Nazi policies. After the war, a variety of things happened that impacted Christianity. In the United States, there was a post-war boom in Christianity and Judaism as well. Large numbers of people flocked to churches. There was an increase in the number of church buildings constructed. There was an increase in people being involved in Bible study. And it was very possible to see frequently public intellectuals discussing religion, especially Christianity, in a variety of public formats, on television, on the radio, in the newspapers and magazines. But in other places, Christians were still facing persecution. After the Second World War, a variety of nations in Eastern Europe, and of course the nation of China, all became communist governments. In Europe, the Orthodox Church often faced similar challenges to the Russian Orthodox Church, the persecution and oppression, and a lot of the freedoms that the Russians had had pre and during the war, those began to disappear as well after World War II. Persecution often relaxed in moments where nationalistic patriotism was needed. So religion was allowed to be more public in these communist countries when it was more important to the nation. Something similar happened in China when the Communist Party came to power in the 1940s. Many religions and religious people found themselves facing persecution with the rise of Chinese communism. Confucius and Confucianism, for example, were revived, even though these were Chinese systems. They were looked upon as a tool of the aristocracy to oppress the lower classes. China's takeover of Tibet forced a lot of Tibetan Buddhists, including their leader, the Dalai Lama, to take refuge in India. Chinese concern about foreigners, the suspicion of anything from outside China, as well as the remembrance of Western imperialism, led to concerns that missionaries in China and Chinese converts were to be looked upon with suspicion, especially since the Vatican and the United States were very anti-communist. So any sort of missionary effort from any of those places was looked upon as trying to destabilize the Chinese government. Missionaries were either kicked out of China or imprisoned, and the government forced Chinese Christians to join officially sanctioned organizations while ostensibly allowing religious freedom. And so the idea there is that they claim to be allowing people religious freedom, but you had to join specific groups. Catholics were expected to join the Catholic Patriotic Association. Protestants were expected to join the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. The three selves were self-government, self-support, and self-propagation. Apparently the idea was that if Chinese Christians were funneled into these organizations and then cut off from outside influence, right, connections with the United States, connections with the Vatican, that they would die off. These people in these groups were required to pledge their support to the government, to stand against imperialism, but actually kind of worked the opposite way. Christian leaders in China were re-educated, or they faced persecution. In the 1960s, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Chairman Mao Zedong, inaugurated a cultural revolution, which was meant to prevent a resurgence of capitalism that was apparently making its way through some of the Chinese leadership. Essentially, the Cultural Revolution was an attempt to purge anything that was against Chairman Mao's regime. All churches were closed, worship gatherings were prohibited, Bibles were burnt. The Three Self-Patriotic Movement was also banned. Again, all of these were attempts to exact control, to bring about the elimination of Christianity, among other things. But essentially, the church went underground, went into hiding, and was developing in house churches, kind of like the very first centuries. And during this time, from the 60s through the contemporary period, these house churches experienced sizable growth. Public worship was permitted again in the late 70s, but there was still this expectation that you would register with the government, which meant that Christians would be under surveillance. And if you worshiped in a state church, you could be positive there was someone there that was spying on you for the government. And so public worship was allowed, but a lot of these unregistered house churches continued. Leaders who were discovered would be imprisoned or persecuted. Questions about the Russian Revolution, World War II, or the Chinese Cultural Revolution? Toward the end of the Cultural Revolution in the United States, conservative Christians were making an impact on the politics of the United States. In the early years of the 20th century, conservative evangelicals, or fundamentalists, that we'll talk about later, had largely retreated from public life and politics. And they had developed a rather separatist mindset. And a variety of things that we'll talk about later on in the 20th century, or later on in this look at the 20th century. But essentially what had happened was, in the 19th century, Christianity had been so intertwined with making impact on culture and society and politics. But by the early 20th century, conservative Christians began to retreat. But by the middle of the 20th century, some of these fundamentalists wanted to be more involved, particularly in shaping the political destiny of the United States and the world. The precursor for this engagement was the ministry of Billy Graham. Graham was born in 1918 near Charlotte, North Carolina. Still alive, so he's getting close to his 100th birthday, but is very ill, so there are certainly questions as to whether he'll reach that. He graduated from Wheaton College, which was an evangelical institution. He would later join the staff of an organization called Youth for Christ, which was a group that was focused on evangelizing teenagers and adults. And for a while he was going around working with Youth for Christ, but he decides he wants to kind of embark on his own, and he wants to reach a broader audience than just teenagers and adults. So he goes around and holds these campaigns across the country, but he's not particularly successful. He goes overseas for a little bit, has some success over there in England, comes back. And what really changes Graham's life is a crusade he holds in 1949. It starts off kind of, again, not that big of a deal, but eventually a few prominent celebrities and athletes claim conversion after going to this Billy Graham crusade, and so that starts to get more attention from the public, and so more and more people start attending these crusades. It goes on for a while. Additionally, a lot of Graham's message was a concern about communism and the impact of atheistic communism on the world and what that would do to Christianity and what that would do to the United States. And so this anti-communist message gains the attention of a newspaper owner named William Randolph Hearst. And Hearst, who was very anti-communist, sees Graham. Right? He's a young man. He's 30 years old. He wears a suit and tie, very well dressed, very articulate. There's a lot of things that Hearst sees in Graham that he really likes. And so he tells his reporters two of the most famous words in Graham that will have an impact in Graham's life: Puff Graham. Essentially saying anything positive you can say about Billy Graham, find a way to work it in. I want you to focus on talking about Billy Graham, talk about his message. And that's what really changes a lot of Billy Graham's life. And his success explodes after that. So much so that he will gain access to presidents from Eisenhower to George W. Bush. Even President Obama, I believe, has met with him as well. In 1960, although Graham has tried to be apolitical, right? He's often tried to say, I'm not interested in politics, I'm interested in saving souls. But in 1960, he met with other evangelical leaders who were interested in preventing Catholic John Kennedy from becoming president, obviously unsuccessful. But despite Graham's involvement with politics, among other things, most fundamentalists were still skeptical about getting involved in politics in American culture. It wasn't something that was encouraged in fundamentalist churches. You weren't really to be involved in voting or any other type of political activity. But a variety of lawsuits in the 1970s brought fundamentalists and evangelicals into the political sphere of the United States. Now, many people might point to the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 about abortion as the moment that sparked evangelical resurgence in politics. Now, certainly, after Roe v. Wade, many in evangelicalism became very active in denouncing abortion and looking for ways to limit it. There wasn't too much of an outcry against Roe, against that decision until the 1980s. Abortion was always looked upon as a Catholic issue by evangelicals. That was something Catholics worried about. And so even though many evangelicals were anti-abortion, they weren't very politically active against it, even after Roe. Instead, what seems to be the case that brings fundamentalists back involved in politics is an attempt by the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University was a fundamentalist university in South Carolina and was very racially discriminatory in its admission policies. It wouldn't allow African Americans to enroll. The only African Americans that were on the campus were those that were in service type of jobs. And the IRS looking at this decides that because it's racist, that does not qualify as a charitable institution, so it shouldn't be tax exempt. This concern over these laws and abortion and the need to be politically involved coalesced into an organization known as the Moral Majority. Evangelicals throughout the 80s, Moral Majority. So the Moral Majority kind of plays on this fear of the government taking an attack on evangelical and fundamentalist institutions and decides to become politically involved in a variety of elections. In 1976, Newsweek magazine had a cover story called The Year of the Evangelical. Georgia Governor and Baptist Jimmy Carter was elected through evangelical hopes that he would help reshape the country. But evangelicals soon became dissatisfied at some of Carter's policies, as well as his appointment of a variety of non-evangelicals to administration posts. And so this is where the Moral Majority really gains power. So there's this disaffection with Carter. And so they take that and turn it into support of Carter's opponent in 1980, Ronald Reagan. And Reagan very astutely successfully garnered the evangelical vote and the presidency. Some evangelicals also became dissatisfied with Reagan and weren't as supportive of his vice president, George Bush. And so evangelical televangelist Pat Robertson, who had been a strong supporter of Reagan but was concerned about Bush, decided to run for the presidency in 1988. He had some early success in some of those very early primaries, but Bush's popularity among other Republicans eventually leads Robertson's withdrawal. The moral majority disbands in 1989. And after Robertson kind of winds down his presidential campaign, he still believes his supporters could be a powerful political force. And so he develops a group known as the Christian Coalition, which is going to essentially fill the vacuum of the disbanding of the moral majority. The moral majority had focused largely on national elections, right? Presidential elections, believing that the way the country's going to change is if we change it top down. The focus of the Christian Coalition, on the other hand, was more of a grassroots. They still believed it was important who you elect as president, who you elect as your senators or your representatives, but they focused more on, we need to get Christians, evangelicals on school boards. We need to get them in as county commissioners. And so the belief was if you make an impact on those local levels, eventually that's going to impact the top as well. Evangelicals were instrumental in the election of George W. Bush in the year 2000, as well as the year 2004. Younger evangelicals, however, have been less accepting of this kind of marriage between politics and Christianity. So it's uncertain how that will play itself out in the future. Questions about the Christian Coalition, the Christian right? Christians, however, weren't just politically active in conservative causes. There were others as well. Not all evangelicals were supportive of this kind of marriage between the Republican Party and evangelicalism. In fact, since the middle of the 20th century, there were many evangelicals who felt that evangelicalism was losing its focus on the impact it should make politically. Fundamentalism had stressed individual salvation. And so in this period where fundamentalism is kind of out of the political influence, the focus is on individual salvation. We change the world as we convert people. And so there's less of this concern for cultural change, again, until the 1970s. Now, fundamentalists did speak out on communism, had been active in some local levels, but largely many of the doctrines of fundamentalism discouraged being active, discouraged social change. So we've looked at conservative evangelicalism. Let's backtrack and look at the other option. Now, conservative and liberal here are referring to their political views, not to their approach to the Bible. Often, conservatives and progressives in evangelicalism held similar theological views, right, about the inspiration of Scripture, the historicity of miracles and Jesus' resurrection. They just held different political views. One of the key figures in the development of this progressive evangelicalism was a man named Karl Pennock. Henry was a preacher, an academic, an editor. He was born in 1913 on Long Island, but his parents were largely irreligious. At the age of 19, he becomes a reporter, eventually an editor for a newspaper, before experiencing conversion in 1933. He would go on to enroll at Wheaton College in Illinois. And the professors there at Wheaton encouraged him to see the Christian mission as not just about individual salvation, but about cultural transformation as well. He would go on to get a PhD from Boston University, eventually teaching at Fuller Theological Seminary in California. In 1947, he releases the work, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. Now, remember, Henry essentially is a fundamentalist. But what he's focusing on is the way that fundamentalism has largely abandoned bringing about cultural change. Fundamentalism, said Henry, was not humanitarian. It did not address the modern evils of the 20th century, things like aggressive warfare, racial hatred, exploitation of labor by management. Fundamentalism, which had come out of the very socially active evangelicalism of the 19th century, had no social passion in the 20th. Fundamentalism was only focused on the evils of alcohol, movies, dancing, without realizing that the gospel spoke to all of life. But on the other hand, liberalism, which was so focused on some of those social issues, ignored the need for personal salvation. And so Henry wants to see, personal salvation, but cultural salvation as well. So he's advocating a conservative theology. He's also advocating right living, addressing social issues. The text advocated progressive reforms, but was general and overly broad, and so it doesn't really make that much of an impact. He would eventually become one of the early editors of Christianity Today. But it's still a period of time when political activism is looked down upon. Fundamentalists do assume that the key to social transformation is personal conversion. Many evangelicals, Henry especially, were not quite sure where to stand on civil rights. Many, especially in the North, took a gradualist position, meaning that eventually transformation would take place. It shouldn't be pushed for politically. Billy Graham, for example, would hold integrated crusades. He would have people of all sorts of races present in his crusades and wouldn't separate, the blacks sit over here, the whites sit over here. But he encouraged Martin Luther King to, as he put it, or as he said, put on the brakes. Others favored more progressive action, including federal intervention, integration, protest marches, demonstrations. Right? All this is trying to figure out how do you be Christian and be involved in politics. One of those individuals was a man named John Anderson. Anderson was a white racial activist. And one of the things that Anderson claimed was God is not just concerned about souls, He's concerned about bodies as well. Right? And so focus just on personal conversion without trying to address some of these social issues, like racism, isn't truly sharing the gospel of God. He worked at a black fundamentalist college for a while. He joins the NAACP. Would eventually found Freedom Now, a magazine dedicated to convincing fundamentalists to accept equality as biblical. Segregation, he said, is a sin. He eventually would get a job teaching at Wheaton, where he would encourage racial concern among the students. And in his lectures, he would begin incorporating insights from black activists, and then he would also include them in the magazine as well. By the late 1960s, however, resistance from other people to Anderson's civil rights push forced him to leave. Another political issue in the latter part of the 20th century for the evangelical left was Vietnam. Many evangelicals, in fact many Americans, supported the Vietnam War in the beginning. As the war went on, however, more and more people grew concerned about it. Communism was spreading in Vietnam, and a lot of people thought containment was necessary. But people began to question whether Vietnam was a just war, due to the amount of violence, the mass death, the loss of loved ones, all of which were for the first time talked about on the news. Scenes were filmed and then were shown on the news, and so people got to see firsthand what was happening over in Vietnam. And so some people became very concerned about this. One progressive evangelical that was very active in this was a man named Wallis. Early on in his life, his focus had been on injustice, racism, supporting the idea that Jesus was on the side of the poor and the marginalized. He would go to Trinity Evangelical Seminary in Chicago to be trained as a theologian. But he would become very vocal on campus about Vietnam, peacemaking, and radical generosity. All these things he thought were consistent with the Sermon on the Mount. He would eventually stop his studies because his activism was taking up so much of his time. Wallis still is active politically, progressively. Another important progressive evangelical in the latter 20th century is Mark Castillo, a senator from Oregon, who just passed away a couple of years ago. He was born in 1922 and grew up in Oregon. His father and mother both had stable jobs, and so they largely weathered the Great Depression. There wasn't the difficulties that a lot of other people faced during the time. He would become politically active at the age of 10, handing out campaign literature. He would work for the Secretary of State of Oregon while he was in college, eventually going on to serve in the Navy in World War II. But while serving in the Navy, he sees the devastation that the nuclear bombs caused. When he comes back, he studied political science at Stanford, teaches as a professor for a while. Eventually, he's elected to the state legislature, will become Secretary of State, will become governor as well. He was a progressive Republican. He's socially conservative on abortion, really before it was the thing to be. I mean, we think now of a lot of Republicans, for example, being anti-abortion. But again, in those early years, the 70s, the 80s, the 60s and the 70s, there wasn't that much of an issue. But Hatfield is one of the first to really be socially conservative on this issue. But he's also concerned about labor issues, age of the poor and elderly. He's concerned about environmentalism, racism. He will eventually go on to question whether Vietnam was a just war as well. He's elected to the United States Senate in 1966. It's shortly after that he will become anti-war. Between 1967 and the middle of 1968, he would give 150 anti-war speeches. He was considered for being the vice president on the Nixon ticket in 1968, but he isn't chosen and would eventually go on to work against some of Nixon's policies, especially when it concerned Vietnam. Ultimately, though, the evangelical left was politically unsuccessful. They were unsuccessful on one hand because other liberals, non-Christian liberals or liberals from other traditions, did not like their conservative theology. And so the fact that they were conservative theologically, believed the Bible was the Word of God, believed in some other things that other liberals didn't like, they weren't very supportive of that. They didn't like the fact that many of these evangelical liberals were also very anti-abortion. And so there's a lack of maintaining a good relationship there. Conservative evangelicals, on the other hand, didn't like their politics. And so they don't like a lot of the positions they're taking. The religious right, the Christian right, was much more successful than the evangelical left, particularly because it was embraced by conservatives, especially Republicans. questions about the evangelical left? While the Christian coalition was coming up, the Soviet Union was coming down. Since the 1940s, the USSR had been engaged in a Cold War with the United States that sometimes did find hot expressions in places like Korea, Vietnam, and even Afghanistan. The proliferation of weapons, particularly nuclear weapons, however, put the Soviet Union in a difficult economic and cultural situation. They were spending more than they had. When Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, he began pushing for forward policies of glasnost and perestroika, essentially transparency and restructuring. The damage was already done, though. And by the early 1990s, the Soviet Union had fallen, and so had most of the other communist governments in Eastern Europe. Often, the Orthodox Church, whether it's the Russian Orthodox Church, the Hungarian Orthodox Church, or any of the other ethnic ones, had often been instrumental in the people's push for the end to communism. Throughout the late 80s and early 90s, the Orthodox Church was becoming much more visible after the fall of communism. But with the fall of communism came missionaries from a variety of other traditions. Additionally, Russia and other countries that came out of the breakup of the Soviet Union faced a moral crisis in government and turned to a variety of Christian groups to help solve it. Kind of as this country is breaking up, in places like Russia, there was a lot of corruption in government. There were a lot of corrupt organizations, Russian mob. And so the government in these places, especially Russia, didn't know how to address these issues. And so they turned to Christian groups to help them solve them. Give them ideas of how do we address this moral issue. Let's turn from politics to talking about culture and society. When we were in the 19th century, we talked about some of the challenges that immigration, urbanization, industrialization brought to society in the United States, England, elsewhere. And so the growing difficulties of immigrants, the lower classes in these urban areas, led some Christians to be concerned about what could be done for these people. How do we help these people who are living in extreme poverty, who are often taken advantage of by labor or by management? And so many of these Christians were interested in applying Christianity to social justice issues. There were some individuals in the 19th century that started to promote these ideas, but by the 20th century, we can really talk about a social gospel. One of the key figures in the social gospel, the key theologian of social gospel, is a man named Walter Rauschenbusch. Rauschenbusch came from a German immigrant family and would eventually become a Baptist minister in Hell's Kitchen in New York City. And you can tell with a name like Hell's Kitchen that it's not particularly a very nice place. He becomes very concerned about the poverty of German immigrants. How can we help these people? But the Christianity that's influencing Rauschenbusch is a liberal Christianity. It's that higher criticism. So he's more a liberal Protestant. He would begin preaching the socially innovative character of Christianity, arguing that Christians were expected to transform society and its structures into the kingdom of God. And like many other liberal Protestants, he was less concerned about individual salvation. It was more of how do we transform society. He would eventually adopt socialism, but without the atheism many socialists included. In 1907, he would publish Christianity and the Social Crisis, noting that human beings had conquered nature, but had not conquered themselves. Biblical religion was about transforming human society, but Christians had failed at this. He would, 3 years later, write a theology for the social gospel, focused on social salvation. Social problems, Rauschenbusch would argue, are religious problems. Evolution, he saw, as a modern form of providence, not necessarily basing this on Darwin, but he was idealistic about this human progress. Right? Humans are progressing. There are other areas where he would make some other types of adjustments to Christian doctrine. Right? The kingdom of God became less about a religious construct and more about a political construct. So he's holding on to the language of Christianity, but reinterpreting it in new ways, largely focused on these social issues. In the kingdom of evil, he said, selfishness reigns and is very evident. And so the focus of the Christian is to turn society into the kingdom of God. And like many liberal Protestants, the focus of Rauschenbusch's theology was on this life, and not as much about the afterlife. Because Rauschenbusch felt a lot of Christians that spent so much time focusing on the afterlife and talking about the afterlife saw it as an escape from this world, instead of being concerned about what kind of things can we transform in this society. But liberal Protestants weren't the only people concerned, the only Christians concerned. Catholics were concerned about social issues as well. And the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century especially, was the period of Catholic action. An effort, or the continuing effort of Catholics to be involved in social issues.
Catholic action, would that be under the social gospel time, or just
It's around the same time, but this is kind of, social gospel is a liberal Protestantism, and Catholic action, of course, is Catholic.
This is kind of a response to social gospel?
Not so much a response to it, it's kind of like this is developing at kind of the same time. Right? So just as Protestants are concerned about what's happening with the poor and the immigrants, Catholics are as well. And this concern for Catholic action in changing society can be seen in a couple of different things. One is in the efforts of the papacy. In 1931, Pope Pius XI released the papal document Quadragesimo Anno, which translates to after 40 years. Essentially, this is after 40 years of Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum was kind of a social manifesto that Pope Leo XIII had published back in 1891. So 40 years after Rerum Novarum, where are we? What's society like? What has happened? Right? And so it's Pius XI's revisiting of Rerum Novarum. But of course, it's a different situation. In the 1930s, you had the Great Depression, the financial panics, the stock market crash. And so Quadragesimo Anno is Pius's reflection on the state of the world, especially in this concern of the Great Depression. But one of the things that we can see in Quadragesimo Anno that reflects a difference of Pius compared to Leo is this shift from a concern of charity to a concern of justice. And specifically, Pius XI calls the Catholic Church to re-examine the views of Thomas Aquinas. The Church needs to oppose economic injustice, going so far as to argue that government should adjust ownership to meet the needs of the public good. Essentially, softening the church's position on socialism. In Rerum Novarum, Leo had emphasized that private property was a divine right. But by the 1930s, Pius XI is more open to sometimes the government has to get involved. He's also very supportive of labor unions, and the ideas behind this encyclical were quite widely preached. And this shift from charity to justice played out in the labor unions and in Catholic celebrities as well. In the 1890s, the church had largely had an ambivalent relationship with labor unions because labor unions were often linked to socialism in Europe. So many Catholics in Europe felt that if they encouraged Catholics to join labor unions, they would develop these kind of conflicting loyalties between the church, the government, and unions. And so there was a lot of suspicion of unions. But in America, of course, in the 1890s, a lot of the working class was Catholics. But there were prohibitions against joining. But many Catholics, particularly the Irish, were drawn to labor unions. The church would later soften its stance when it sees that there's not necessarily this oppositional relationship between the church and the unions. And so by the 1910s, the Catholics are joining labor unions in large numbers. But not only are Catholics joining labor unions, many priests are becoming what we might call labor priests. They're not just focused on ministering to their flock, performing mass, educating children. They're also interested in being involved in a variety of, like labor strikes, being involved in other things that will help labor against men. Many Catholics were enthusiastically supportive of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. And these labor priests really became reformer priests. They preached this social vision of the church, this outward-oriented vision. And many of these priests were often very liberal in thinking about their economic issues. So we have efforts from the papacy to try and address some of these social issues. You have these labor priests who are active in helping workers and other things. But then you also have some very famous Catholics who were involved in trying to address social issues as well. People like Dorothy Day, who had been born in Brooklyn in 1897, but in her early life has been very radical, was interested in anarchist movements, these societies without governmental rules. But in 1927, she converted to Catholicism. She had been a committed socialist when she converted, and so she kind of married her socialism to her Catholicism. And she often felt that her socialist beliefs really led her deeply into the Catholic faith. And she was, again, although socialist, although had been very radical, is orthodox in a lot of respects. Very supportive of the hierarchy as well. In 1932, she meets a man named Peter Marin, who with Day formed the Catholic Worker, which was both a newspaper and then a movement as well. The Catholic Worker, the newspaper, advocated labor unions. They were very critical of modern capitalism. And being a labor paper, it was the price for the Catholic Worker was a penny. Very cheap for people to get it. The Catholic Worker movement was a very utopian movement. This idea of this great transformation that could take place. And Dorothy Day especially advocated radical acts of mercy. She would set up houses of hospitality, some of which are still around today. Places where anyone could come for food, clothing, and shelter. She also advocated voluntary poverty, saying that people should be like Christ with and among the poor. Ultimately, though, she identifies with radicals and communists because she feels that they related better with the sacrifice of Christ. And Christ in solidarity with suffering people, Christ accepting others' suffering. She sets up houses in most of the major cities. But even though she never officially challenged the church, believed in the wisdom of the church, was very devout and obedient, often had this uneasy relationship because she's a layperson, right? She's not a nun, so she's not in the hierarchical system. She's a woman, being very vocal politically and religiously. She was also very important for laying the foundations for the Catholic peace movement. War, they felt, violated the dignity of human beings. And war improperly used resources to hurt people. Resources that could be used to feed people, to shelter them. And so she advocated pacifism. Questions about Catholic action or the social gospel? The push for social justice in the latter part of the 20th century also acquired a focus on race issues. While the push for civil rights had a political focus, right, the focus was on legislation passing or repealing legislation, the leaders in civil rights often came from churches. The opposition to the civil rights movement sometimes also came from churches. Sometimes it was churches preaching against civil rights, claiming that God wanted the races segregated. Sometimes it was churches and ministers preaching against the political activity of ministers. Jerry Falwell, in the early 60s, preached against ministers being involved in marches for equality. Ministers should not be involved in politics, he said. They should be in the pulpit. Within a decade or so, he was one of the founders of the moral majority. See how that works? The most famous minister involved in the push for civil rights, of course, was Martin Luther King Jr. Born Michael King in 1929, he and his father later started using Martin Luther King to connect with the Protestant reformer. His father was also a minister, and Martin Jr. became a minister in 1948. And then would eventually become the minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama in 1954. He received a doctorate in systematic theology from Boston University in 1955, although it was discovered much later that sizable parts of his dissertation were plagiarized. His doctorate, however, was not revoked. He came to the forefront of attention in 1955 during the Montgomery bus boycott, after Rosa Parks had refused to give up her bus seat to a white patron. She was defended by Fred Gregg, a part-time minister in the Montgomery area Churches of Christ. King would go on to lead a successful year-long boycott of the bus system that resulted in the integration of the buses in Montgomery. Eventually, leadership in the civil rights movement pushed King away from full-time ministry towards spending more time with his activities with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King was very active in a variety of causes throughout the South. Much of his emphasis, of course, was on nonviolent resistance. He's heavily influenced by Rauschenbusch's social gospel, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and Gandhi's nonviolent resistance to British governments in India. He would stage boycotts, sit-ins, and marches. Often these were met with violence and oppression, which gradually turned the popular opinion in that defenseless people were having dogs and fire hoses turned on. But he often faced opposition from white clergy who thought his activities would create civil disturbances and that changes should be left to the courts. We can see some of this in his letters from Birmingham City Jail in April 1963. Essentially a response to many of the white clergy who were concerned about King's presence in Birmingham and the disruption that it was causing in the city. The center of the African American struggle, argued King, was the meaning of Christian discipleship. Quote, "I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their thus saith the Lord far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city of the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid." You deplore, he would later on in the letter say, you deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham. But I am sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. But as I continued to think about the matter, he would go on to say, I gradually gained a bit of satisfaction from being considered an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist in love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel of Jesus Christ? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I can do none other, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. Was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of an extremist we will be. Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the cause of justice? In all of this, in all of King's sermons and talks and writings, it's important to remember King's credentials as a minister. His messages are not so much speeches as they are sermons. Of course, one of his most famous speeches is the I Have a Dream speech, given on August 28, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington for Civil Rights. It's not just a speech, although it's a political event, and there's a lot of people there, and he's at the Lincoln Memorial, and he's, not in a church building. It's a sermon, not a speech. And when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and hamlet, from every state and city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Catholics and Protestants, will be able to join hands and to sing the words of the old meager spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Toward the end of his life, King began to broaden his attention beyond injustice against African Americans in the United States to injustice globally. Particularly concerning was the United States involvement in Vietnam, for example. Any questions about civil rights or any of these other forms of social Christianity?
This is not a great question. This is something I heard one time. Do you know if there's any... well, I heard one time that Martin Luther King Jr. and some of his other things involved in like some weird orgies and sexual activity. Do you know if there's any validity to that? That is what weird claims.
Yeah, I don't know about any of the validity to that. I do know that you know, he does have some affairs, and so he doesn't live up to his the morals all the time. But some of that extreme stuff, I don't know if it was anything like
It is based off of that.
that. Any other questions? Let's go ahead and finish there for today. We'll cut it a little short, and we'll pick up on Tuesday with some other things in culture and society, and then move on into doctrine.